My name is Jill Zippin, and I am chairwoman of Democratic Jewish Outreach Pennsylvania, and we are a member of the Jewish Battleground Coalition. The Jewish Battleground Coalition is made up of Arizona, Texas, Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, Georgia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. As a very famous woman once said, we are better together. We believe by combining our efforts, we can elect Democrats across the battleground states and turn purple states blue and keep blue states bluer. Um, Today, if you please put yourself on mute if you are not. Thank you for attending the event, Gun Violence is a Jewish Issue. As Jews, like everyone else, we are deeply concerned about shootings in our schools and in our streets. Additionally, gun violence is often tied to anti-Semitism, racism, and hatred of the other. Because of that, we as Jews have a heightened concern around this issue. We, in fact, have been targets and continue to be targets of gun violence, from the Tree of Life Synagogue right here in Pennsylvania to Jewish community centers and Jewish preschools. We believe gun violence must be addressed because this issue impacts not just us as Jews, but really everyone. We will hear from Representative Joaquin Castro, who will be introduced by Rosalie Weisfeld of Texas. He will say a few words, we'll do some Q&A, and then Linda Frank of Wisconsin will introduce Christian Haney, he's Vice President of Policy of the Brady Campaign. He'll say a few words and we'll do Q&A. If you have any questions that you would like me to address to the speakers, please put those questions in the chat and I will try to get to them. So I'm going to begin with Rosalie Weisfeld, who will be introducing the congressman. Take it away, Rosalie.
Thank you so much. My name is Rosalie Weisfeld. As Jill mentioned, I am the chair of the Texas Jewish Democratic Caucus here in Texas. And I am so proud to introduce my friend, Congressman Joaquin Castro. I met Joaquin when he was running for state representative so many years ago, and my daughter worked on his campaign. And I also had the opportunity to meet his twin brother that so many people confuse him with. And both of them in their own rights are stars in our Democratic Party and work so hard to do what is necessary to make sure that our state, our country, and visitors to our country, people doing business here, have everything that they need to lead a genuinely kind life. Joaquin Castro, as I mentioned, has served in the Texas House. He has been honored to represent San Antonio and the surrounding areas in the U.S. House of Representatives since 2013. And 2013 was significant because that's when his eldest daughter was also born. And now in his fifth term, Joaquin serves on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and the House Education and Labor Committee. Joaquin's work in Congress focuses on building out what he calls the infrastructure of opportunity, the good public schools, high quality healthcare system, and a well-paying jobs that allow folks to pursue their American dream. On a personal note, I also want to do a shout out to his father-in-law, who is from the Rio Grande Valley, where I'm from, and congratulate him on his third child, who was recently born, Ana Valentina, I believe. So thank you so much for being here, Congressman. And also, on one last note, in regards to this horrible issue of gun violence, I want to thank him for co-sponsoring in San Antonio an event that was held last week. Really appreciate you being a voice for genuine common sense gun control. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rosalie, so much for all of your years of friendship and, more importantly, for all of your years of leadership in the Texas Democratic Party, and most especially in the Rio Grande Valley, where my wife is from. So thank you so much for all of it. and also to the Jewish Battleground Coalition for everything that y'all are doing to help get the vote out ahead of the 2022 midterm elections. Oftentimes, as y'all know, whenever you have your president in the White House, historically, you often face a headwind. And so we're going to have to do everything that we can to call everybody we know, knock on every door we can, contribute every dollar we can to battleground races to make sure that we can get every vote out that we can so that we can hold on to the Senate and hold on to the House of Representatives and put Joe Biden in a good position in 2024. So thank you, Jill, and everybody who's part of this great coalition. And also, I have to say to the Jewish community generally that has been a backbone of the Democratic Party for generations now. Thank you so much for that. Especially, I say that as a Texan, where there's so many folks who had a chance to leave the Democratic Party over the years and went from Democrat to Republican. And I see so many Jewish Democrats who, even through the lean years, stuck with the Texas Democratic Party. And I always say a big thank you for that, because we are on our way back. And so thank you also for including us on the states that you count as battleground states, because we believe that we are getting closer and closer to actually flipping Texas. So thank you for that as well. And then let me get to the heart of what we're talking about today, which is gun violence, and start by talking about what happened in Uvalde. Of course, it was an ugly tragedy, and I had a chance to visit just a few days after it happened. And the devastation to what is a small town that's about 75 miles from my home can't be overstated. The devastation to the families, to the community. You can see as you read about it, and you still see stories about it in the media, how that community is still reeling from everything that happened. And when I talked to a few of the family members, I went at a time where a lot of them were still not talking to many folks at all. But the few that I was able to talk to, they kept asking me a few questions and making a few points. First, they didn't understand basic things like how in Texas, an 18-year-old could go into a gun store and get 2 AR-15s, but you can't even go buy cigarettes or beer in Texas at that age. And why even somebody just using common sense wouldn't change that and wouldn't be in favor of changing that. And then you can imagine they were also very disturbed by the law enforcement response, not just local law enforcement, but also state and federal law enforcement officers who were on scene. And it took, by most accounts that we've seen, close to an hour, over an hour, for them to actually go in there and take on the killer and try to save those kids. And they kept wondering why it happened to them and to their kids in Uvalde, Texas. And so those are the issues that that Congress has been grappling with. But as you all know, it's sad to say that Congress has been grappling with these issues for a long time, and very little has gotten done during that time. Even though we've had shootings not only in elementary schools like in Sandy Hook and Uvalde, you've also had them in high schools like in Santa Fe in Texas. We've had them in synagogues at Tree of Life. We've had them in churches like at Sutherland Springs. We've had them in workplaces, in malls, in just about every format and place that you can imagine. Which is why when I see proposals that talk about hardening schools or adding extra security or police officers to schools, my question is, well, what do we do about all the other places? What do we do about the churches and the synagogues and the workplaces and the malls out there? That's not going to fix the fundamental issue of gun violence at those places. And in states like Texas, governors and politicians, Republican politicians, have simply made it too easy for dangerous people to get dangerous weapons in their hands. And after the massacre in El Paso, you all probably remember in August of 2019, more than 20 people were killed and 20 people injured by a madman who drove more than 10 hours and killed over 23 people because he considered them, quote unquote, Hispanic invaders to Texas. After that, Governor Abbott promised that he would make it harder for things like that to happen in Texas again. And he actually he signed into law laws that made it easier for dangerous people to get dangerous weapons in their hands. And as you all know, it's been tough in Congress because Republicans have blocked every attempt just about for us to do anything on banning assault weapons, or even on things like that the American people agree on, like universal background checks. When you have almost 90% of Americans that support universal background checks, if you think about it, there really isn't a debate among the American people about whether they want that. It's a bunch of politicians who are not listening to the overwhelming sentiment of Americans. And unfortunately, that's where the Republican Party is right now. They're not listening to the
I'm going to interject. I have a question that goes exactly to what you said.
Sure.
So a question that I get all the time, and I hear from other people. So 90% of Americans want background checks, even, 67% I've heard of NRA members, 70% of Republicans, you hear these numbers. So if the vast majority of Americans, even NRA members, Republicans, want life-saving gun legislation such as background checks, safe storage, limits to magazine size, closing loopholes, why does the GOP vote against what their actual voters want? There seems to be a disconnect. If their voters want it, you would think if they want to be reelected, they would support these things. Can you explain that disconnect? Because that's
Sure.
the question.
Yeah, I'll give you my best assessment about why I think that is. Well, first, in Congress, districts are incredibly gerrymandered. So you have a lot of Republicans who are in districts where the primary determines the whole race. In other words, they're not really worried about November, right? And we have a lot of districts like that as well as Democrats. But so what happens is that the most extreme elements of their party are the ones that predominate. And I'll give you an example also of the pressure that we've all seen them face. Y'all may have paid attention, especially if you're in Texas, to what happened at the Texas Republican Convention this past weekend, where people like Ted Cruz and Dan Crenshaw were called rhinos because people thought they weren't conservative enough on these issues. John Cornyn was literally booed. You would have thought John Cornyn showed up at the Democratic convention in Texas the way he was booed when he went over to Dallas and spoke in front of the Republicans. So they do everything they can to intimidate their politicians, to get them to go along. And ultimately, most of them do, as you can see. Most of them end up doing that. And the senators included that back down. And so what you end up with is what is a productive but tepid proposal by John Cornyn to do something on gun reform. But that's my best estimate, is that you got these highly gerrymandered districts. The primary electorate for Republicans is highly charged. They basically get scared out of doing anything, and they're choosing to preserve their own political careers. And really, at this point, I think on some level, they're physically scared of the menace that is within the Republican Party. I think some of them are physically scared of violence against them and their families. And so that's part of the reason.
Right. I saw the Kissinger on the January 6th committee. His new, young child and his wife were physically threatened. It was just in the news before we sat down here. It seems as if, the gerrymandered system in these primaries are allowing minority rule on issues on which there's vast agreement. It seems quite unfortunate. I want to ask you about the package that passed out of the House compared to the package in the Senate. They're very different packages.
Right.
Talk about what's passed out of the House, what the Senate's working on, where they differ, and is there any crossover between the two?
Yeah, I mean, they're fairly different. As you can imagine, the House package, which was led by Democrats, is much more significant. It raises the age to get an assault weapon from 18 to 21. It includes safe storage, includes background checks, a lot of the things that we've been fighting for a long time. The Senate package is much more lukewarm. It includes, for example, ours includes mandatory red flag laws, right? Theirs is much more optional or conditional based on whether states accept. So, for example, what I mean by that is it sets aside a pot of money to incentivize states to adopt red flag laws. But as you all know, look, I'm in a state in Texas where the governor and the Republican legislature still have not expanded Medicaid over a decade later, right? And so the one important thing that the Senate framework, because there's no bill language yet, but what it does is it closes the boyfriend loophole. That's an important thing, so that, you know, if somebody was convicted of domestic violence, for example, you know, if they were married to the person, that would enable law enforcement to keep that person, or a judicial system to keep that person from getting a weapon. But if they weren't married to that person, if they were just a boyfriend, for example, then it wouldn't. So it closes that loophole. That's an important thing, and that would be mandatory. But I would suggest when y'all look at these proposals, try, as you read through the legislation, try to read through in the proposal or the law, what is it that the federal government is requiring of states and of everybody else? And what are they just incentivizing or making optional? Because in places like Texas and Florida and some other states, if you're just incentivizing it or making it optional, our governors, I can tell you, I would suspect Abbott is just not going to accept the money and just going to decline to do it. Now, there may be other places, maybe in Pennsylvania, maybe in some of the other states, where you do get positive movement. But in some of the large states like Florida and Texas, it won't have an effect, I think, unfortunately, in those areas.
Now, when you talk about these bills, the House bill and the Senate bill, but with respect specifically to the Senate bill, you know, some have said the Senate bill is very consequential because it's really the first piece of gun legislation we've had in 30 years. Other people say this is really milquetoast and it's not doing anything. Thus far, we don't have anything. But what is your thought on whether this is consequential or whether it's milquetoast? Or what are your thoughts on that when you're asked about it?
Yeah, well, first, look, if the framework is turned into legislative language, into a bill, and it comes the way that it's been described, I will vote for it. I will support it, right? I'm not going to do a protest vote where I say, hey, you know, I want more. Although I understand that sentiment. It is consequential because it is important that 10 Republican senators have said, hey, we'll try to do something. And like I said, there's a few provisions in there that are mandatory, including closing the boyfriend loophole. So that's a good thing. But in terms of what is required, especially as Democrats, what we believe is required to actually make a dent in this issue in a big way, it's not close enough. We need a lot more, you know. And you know, we often, like Republicans will often get into this debate that it's not a gun issue, it's a mental health issue, or it's a bullying issue, or so, and other things. You know, we know that fundamentally, even somebody who's mentally disturbed, if they don't have an AR-15 or a semi-automatic weapon, they're probably not going to be able to shoot 20 or 30 people in a matter of 45 seconds, the way we see now at a lot of places. So doing something about that weapon makes a difference.
Do you believe if what they're discussing in the Senate gets out of the Senate, and it seems very tenuous now, particularly with the boyfriend loophole and so on, but if it makes its way to the House, do you believe it will clear the House?
Yeah, it'll clear the House. I believe so. Now, you know, again, you've just heard a little bit of chatter of people, not too much, but a little bit of Democrats saying, hey, I don't know if we should do this because they're not going far enough, and they're not going far enough. But I do think that we need to seize on the opportunity. And then let me just add this last point about why in this case, I don't think that we can let the perfect be the enemy of the, I don't know, I'm not going to say good, but of something, right? Because I believe that our voters are getting dispirited. I believe that our voters are losing faith that we can do anything on issues like gun reform and on other issues like immigration. For years, we have told them that we're going to work in Washington to change things, and then over and over, nothing is happening, and people are getting very dispirited. And it's hard to satisfy folks and satisfy your promises to folks when that happens. But it's also hard to engage voters, quite honestly, when over and over their hopes are dashed. So it would represent forward progress, even though I think it's much short of what we actually need.
So, as you said, the U.S. has the same mental health and violent TV shows and the same problems of our European partners and as the rest of the world, yet we far exceed them in gun deaths. the issue is guns. We simply have too many guns, too much ammunition, but it seems to me that the GOP has taken control of the messaging and has been a more effective messenger. So what can, you and other elected officials do to make sure that the legislation we've been discussing gets passed and that the messaging is correct? Because the GOP tends to put it in terms of freedom and rights. And I feel often that the Democratic message doesn't get heard. So what can we do so our voices are heard?
Well, sadly, I think with the state of affairs, the way that gun laws exist now, I think we're going to keep seeing these massacres happen. And in fact, there's so many incidents that have happened since Uvalde. Even in Washington, D.C. yesterday, there was a shooting in a crowd. In San Antonio yesterday, there was a shooting that left, I think, 2 people dead, but 20 or 30 rounds were fired off at somebody's house barbecue party. And the reason I say that is when it comes to what our message is, I've been saying that our lax gun laws allow dangerous people to get dangerous weapons. And somebody who's 18 years old and has been leaving clues all over social media that they're going to harm somebody, or the guy in Buffalo that literally had a private chat with 15 people and told them exactly where he was going to go and what he was going to do, and nobody reported it to police. There are red flags that people leave that we have to take advantage of. So that's the important thing, is taking away these dangerous weapons from dangerous people.
So when we think of shootings, often we think of mass shootings in schools and synagogues and churches, movie theaters, nail salons, concerts. However, these headline shootings cause us to overlook everyday shootings in major American cities. I live in the city of Philadelphia, and any given week, there's dozens of shootings and often dozens of deaths. And it happens in cities like Philadelphia, Miami, Chicago, Los Angeles. And these are the shootings that tend to be ignored. They don't make the headlines. They tend to be in Section B, the local section. They don't make the nightly news. But communities all over the country are really impacted by what I call these everyday daily shootings. Cities need more community violence intervention programs and more resources to bring an end to some of these shootings, in addition to all the laws we're talking about. What, if anything, is Congress doing about things like community violence intervention programming, having resources available to underserved cities?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And well, first, if you look at the COVID legislation that we've passed, there was more resources for all of those things, but also our proposal more recently, there is money for intervention. And there is actually money for more mental health care, all of it, even though Republicans try to make that the exclusive reason that people go around shooting folks, right? And also, one thing that we don't talk about often enough is not just the homicides, but also the suicides. Most of the time when somebody fires a gun off at somebody, they're firing it off at themselves. And so, 2/3 of the total shootings are when somebody owns a gun and they're using it are actually suicides, right? So that's a big issue. So it's all of those things. But I think the background check issue will help with that, so that people can't get guns in their hands that shouldn't have them. The red flag laws, so when they actually leave clues, you can keep guns from them. But then, yes, more investment in community intervention and resources.
Before we go to our next speaker, I want to conclude by saying, every time a shooting happens, everyone seems to say we can't let this continue to happen. And then children are killed. Our youth are dying in the street, literally dying in the streets. We all say we're concerned, and then the next big news cycle hits and we move on. Will this time be different? Will we get anything passed this time? I'd like to hear your thoughts, because as I've been watching the news, it seems as if there may not be the will once again to push anything through as mild as this new set of laws may be.
I think this week is going to be extremely important, because so far, John Cornyn, the Republicans who negotiated with Senate Democrats, Chris Murphy and others, but mostly Chris that was heading it, they put together a framework, but at some point that framework has to be put into bill language and it has to be put on the floor of the Senate to be voted upon. And I say this week is critical because after this week, I believe the Senate, but the House for sure goes on like a 3-week break, right? And we don't, like, once we leave after this coming week, we don't come back into session until July 12th. So time has a way of blunting momentum and stopping momentum. So originally, Chuck Schumer had said that he wanted to be able to vote on that bill in the Senate this coming week. So if we go through this week, if we get through Friday and nothing is voted upon, or at least you don't have bill language yet, that's a troubling sign. And I'll tell you right now, it does not help that John Cornyn went to the Republican convention and they treated him like he was a liberal Democrat at that convention, because it makes everybody shy now, all those folks shy about sticking their necks out. But look, I believe we can get something done. And obviously I hope that we get something done, but that's the headwind that we're facing.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. I know you only had a half hour to be with us. So thank you. Thank you for being with us. It was important to hear what's going on in both the House and the Senate with these gun bills. Hopefully you will have something from the Senate to vote on. Any of you on the Zoom who want to support Congressman Castro, there's a link where you can make a donation. And again, thank you for being with us and thank you for this conversation. And now Linda Frank of Wisconsin, can you introduce Kristen Heine, please?
Sure. I'm Linda Frank. I'm co-chair of Wisconsin Jewish Democrats. And here in Milwaukee, we have daily and nightly shootings too that don't make the nightly news necessarily, although we had a Sikh temple where there was literally a massacre several years ago. And it's hardly an isolated problem in any part of our country. Christian Heine is the Vice President of Policy at the Brady Campaign, and he came to this position after having been Legislative Director at the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. We all know as advocates that stories are impressive, and stories, we bring in people with stories, for whatever we're advocating for. Christian, unfortunately, has his own family story. Memorial Day several years ago, his parents were shot to death. This is not the kind of story you want to have as an advocate, but it certainly reinforces his expertise and firsthand knowledge of what can happen. So Christian Heine, welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, thank you so much.
Can you give an opening remark? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jill, and thank you, Linda. And thank you everybody for being here today for this important conversation. Like Linda referenced, I come to this work like so many other people do. My name is Christian Heine. I'm the Vice President of Policy here at Brady. But I come to the work because 17 years ago, my parents had just come home from a wonderful holiday vacation with each other. They had spent the weekend. They borrowed a boat from my dad's best friend, and on that boat, they spent the weekend getting sunburnt and eating barbecue and enjoying Memorial Day the way that you should, with their 2 dogs, and just had a trip for the books. When they came back to return that boat to my dad's best friend, a gunman lay in wait to shoot my dad's best friend. And because my parents were there, he turned the gun on them as well. My dad, we're very fortunate. My dad did survive being shot multiple times. But while he was being shot by the gunman, while the gunman followed him, he was trying to draw him away from my mother. My mother hadn't run away. Neighbors said that she stayed behind to keep pressure on their friend to keep him alive. And when the gunman returned, he let my mom beg for her life. She ran about 10 steps away, and then he shot and killed her with a single bullet to the back. Now, This gunman went on to terrorize our entire community. He broke into a home. He bludgeoned a mother to death in front of her 2 children, put those kids in the ICU. He shot and wounded a police officer. He ultimately took his own life. The trauma that we all experienced, that our community experienced, it didn't stop that day. It didn't stop when our story stopped being written. It is pain and trauma that we continue to live with every single day. I just experienced our 17-year anniversary of this shooting. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about her laugh. I don't think about how awful it is that she can't be here today and experience being a grandmother, that she will never be able to meet my wife or meet my nieces. And that's what gun violence looks like in America. Jill mentioned it earlier, right? There is the way in which Americans pay attention to gun violence is different than how Americans experience gun violence, right? We turn on our TVs and we see the mass shootings that are horrific. They are uniquely American, the mass casualty shootings that we have in this country. We also live with every single day the fact that more than 100 people are shot and killed every single day in this country. 2 to 3 times that number. People are injured and live with those injuries. This last 2020, the most recent data that we have, we saw a 25-year high in homicides in this country. I just don't know what else it will take. And looking at the faces of these children in Uvalde, the fact that we have to differentiate between the mass casualty shootings that we're talking about that took place at elementary schools. You know, I think about the horrific shooting in Philadelphia a few years at the Tree of Life Synagogue. I can tell you that 17 years ago, one of the first families and groups of families that I ever met were from the Jewish Community Center shooting that took place in Southern California, where children were shot, children who are now adults with their own children, that looked so eerily similar to these photos that we saw in Uvalde and so eerily similar to what we saw in Sandy Hook. We have got to do something different. Because
I agree, and I'm going to interject. I do have
Yeah.
Tree of Life for all my Pittsburghers on this. Was in Pittsburgh, not Philadelphia.
Pittsburgh, so sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I'll get reprimanded by my Pittsburgh folks.
That is very, very fair. It was a slip of the tongue. I apologize. Actually, all my in-laws from Philadelphia will be equally as upset. I promise.
Okay. So I was reading a little bit about you, and your father said something very interesting, and I'm going to ask you to address it. He said in an article, when one person dies, it affects 40 people forever. And I found that very impactful, because when you think about gun violence, the person is gone, but the ramifications are like a ripple when you throw a stone into a pond. Can you speak to that a little bit, particularly as yourself being a survivor when having had parents who were shot and one who was killed?
The ripple effect of gun violence is exponential. And when I say those numbers, right, like more than 100 people every single day, right, 2 to 3 times that are injured, whose lives are forever affected. The numbers that we're not talking about is all of the connected family members and community members who are never the same ever since, you know, from that day on. And still to this day, 17 years later, I get emails. It's not just the community and the way that we were torn apart and we came together because they had to lift us up in that moment, right? My faith community, my friends, my family, my mom's work colleagues. My mom was a big volunteer as a part of our church growing up, and the folks that she had done that volunteer work with, the homeless shelters, the people she had helped in her own work, help find work, or that she had stayed up with or helped give resources when they were going through trauma. All of these interconnected individuals in our lifetimes are all impacted in unique and different ways because of the way that gun violence rips apart our communities, and that trauma, it's not short term, that's long term. I still to this day have people reach out to me who my mom had touched their lives when they were together in high school. I just got an email 2 weeks ago of somebody with everything going on who contributed to Brady because in my mom's honor, somebody who I'd never met in my life and who had dated my mother in high school and had left such a lasting impact that that he still feels connected to our family because of that. He's reached out to my dad, they've gotten coffee. That ripple effect is really significant and something that's important to think about, that these aren't statistics. They're human
Right.
beings in their communities.
And when we're talking about mental health, you know, it's not just beforehand, obviously, to stop someone from committing suicide or committing a violent act. It's also after the fact, as you mentioned, of those who are impacted. Now, you're vice president of policy for Brady, and I want to turn our attention and go back to a little bit of the discussion we had with Representative Castro about the pieces of legislation that are out there. We spoke about a House bill that was passed, but the focus right now is on the bill in the Senate. Can you speak to, as Vice President of Policy for Brady, what Brady's position is, what your position is, what you think about this legislation? Do you believe it to be consequential?
Yeah, look, and I'm going to root this in something just that is functionally just a part of my life, right? And why I've dedicated my life to this work is the fact that I said 17 years ago that if there was something I could do, anything I could do to prevent some family, some community, some child, some parent from knowing the trauma and pain of gun violence in the way that I have and that my family has, I was going to do everything in my power to try to prevent that from happening. I think that this framework, now the details will matter. The details will really, really, really matter. But the framework itself has the potential to save lives and to reduce gun violence in this country. Is it everything that we need to address the scale of gun violence and the public health epidemic that we experience here? Absolutely not. There is much more that we need to do to address gun violence in all of its forms, including fixing our background check system, as mentioned earlier. But ERPO funding, extreme risk funding, to make sure that we are removing guns responsibly from individuals in crisis temporarily, has and will continue to save lives. For every 10 to 20 orders that are issued, these orders that are issued, at least one suicide is prevented. It has prevented a number of mass shootings, and that's been studied too. The CVI funding you mentioned earlier, right? The community violence intervention funding that will likely be a part of this package has the ability to create generational change to break cycles of gun violence in communities most impacted. Addressing the boyfriend loophole. I mean, this is a loophole that has existed where if you are dating someone who is abusing you and you are not married to that person, you are not given the same protections that you would otherwise be giving. That there are elements of this package that are going to be very important, and it will certainly fall short. But my hope is that in our ability to execute on something that could save lives, that's the most important thing to me any day of the week. But then when Republicans wake up the next morning and the sky hasn't fallen, when the supporters, gun owners, non-gun owners alike, that come together and many people can be rewarded from these positions, then at the end of the day, it could usher in a new era of what's in the realm of possibility for gun violence prevention. For those reasons, I think that we're in a historic moment.
Thank you. Another policy question for you. So when I started out, I talked about the fact that there's been a rise in hate crimes, a rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic hate crimes. Did the Brady campaign weigh in on the domestic terror bill, which every single Republican voted, or the majority of the Republicans voted against? Because what do you see as the connection between this domestic terror bill, if any, and gun violence? Because I see a connection between the two.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, right? And I think moreover than anything, I think the point that what makes hate so lethal in this country is our access to firearms, right? That is something that hate exists in other places. The reason why it does not translate to this kind of gun violence and gun death and threats of gun violence and armed intimidation is simply because of our access to these kinds of weapons. I will say that I think that this is really critical, important, life-saving legislation, and we also need to address our access to firearms, right? These things are not, it's the same thing as our mental health system, right? That it is critically important that we create access to care. We're not promoting stigmas that can create barriers to care. We should be ensuring that there's funding for mental health access, for behavioral access, and at the same time, we need to deal with our lax firearm laws that allow anybody to be able to go out and buy a gun in many states without so much as a background check. And I'll give you one further example, right? One of the pieces of legislation that we promote all the time and have tried to move forward, and it received a markup last Congress, is the Disarm Hate bill that David Cicilline carries, where it is a policy where if you are convicted of a misdemeanor hate crime in most states in this country, that does not carry a prohibition to purchase or possess firearms. You can see a direct correlation here where, of course, if somebody has been convicted of a hate crime, you don't want them to be able to access weapons legally. We do nothing to prevent that from happening in this country. So there is a clear tie. And lastly, I'll say one more thing. There is, and this, in the wake of January 6th, we've written a lot about this. The corrupted view of the Second Amendment that we have seen in the last 20 years purported and pushed by the National Rifle Association, by a number of militia groups, and by the Republican Party leadership at large has been incredibly terrifying and has led to the emboldening of individuals who are hateful from using their weapons to not only intimidate in places like Virginia, Richmond, Virginia last year, then in Michigan, where a number of these militia members were arrested by the FBI for their plot to kidnap and assassinate Governor Whitmer, and ultimately in January 6th, when they had a violent insurrection at the U.S. Capitol just down the street from where I am right now. All of these things are interconnected. They didn't happen overnight. It has been, in 2009, Wayne LaPierre said the guys with the guns make the rules. We are seeing that come to life right now, and it's the Republican Party that has been fanning those flames. I'm hopeful that the moment that we're in is one in which that will not be the trajectory we have to remain on, because there's too much at stake in this country if we allow it to continue. So all of these themes are completely interconnected. You're exactly right. We also need to deal with the guns.
So I want to talk a little bit about the courts, because they're very important too. As many people know on this call, Scalia and the Republican court expanded gun rights under the Heller decision. And many, people say that there are no limits. There should be no limits on the Second Amendment, even though there are limits to free speech, like you can't yell fire in a movie theater and so on. But now we have a case that should be coming down in the next week or two that deals with the New York gun law in the Supreme Court. And there's concern that there will be an even further expansion of gun rights beyond Heller. Can you talk to us? Now, obviously, the decision has not been released yet, but can you talk to us what you know about that case and what you expect the court to do?
Yeah, we are watching this case very closely, and you're absolutely right to be to raise it. I think that when it comes out, it will have broad implications for what we can and can't do. The case in reference is it's NYRSPA versus Bruen. And the case specifically is calling into question New York's gun law that says who can and cannot carry loaded weapons through in public with a concealed carry permit. States, by and large, over time have had their own laws and been able to dictate sort of just the way that federalism works, right? to be able to ask for a higher threshold as they are issuing permits to carrying loaded weapons in public. Now, the reason why this is significant is New York requires more than what some other states do. They actually utilize discretion in their ability to sort of say who can and cannot. There is an application process, and they law enforcement uses discretion when issuing those permits. So we have the sort of immediate question of will this Supreme Court, a Supreme Court where 5 of these justices were appointed by presidents who lost the popular vote, right? Where we could see a 5-4 or something like that decision that could fundamentally tell states that they no longer can tell us who can and cannot carry loaded weapons in public. And then we are going to have to immediately react and push back. Now, there could be broader implications depending on how they write that decision. But this is monumental because look, the same way that Heller had upended hundreds of years of precedent for what the Second Amendment really lays out as a Second Amendment right. This has the potential to expand that with a court that has already been showing itself to be even historically, I think, extreme in the moment that we're at. So we'll be watching this closely. We're going to need folks to make noise. And I think it's why actions like what's happening in the Senate matter so much. We have got to raise the floor for the ways that we protect Americans in this country. That has been happening incredibly well. Like passing laws has worked incredibly well in the states, but we need Congress to step up and do the same things so that we can really have a difference and an impact here.
I know there's supposed to be a batch of decisions coming out in the next couple of days, I think including the abortion decision this week. Do you think that Congress or the Senate would throw that fix in there, or probably if the court were to expand it, or is that just a pipe dream?
Do I think that
if the court expands the gun rates with regard to that New York case, is that something that can be added to the federal legislation?
I imagine that in whatever terms the Supreme Court issues that decision, like you said, this could happen this week. That when they do, it will be incumbent upon the states to react and make something happen. Now, I hope, to your point, that there is a way to further inspire Congress to do more, as there should, because it will be a clear-cut example that they haven't done enough for the last, I say 30 years, but we know it's a lot longer than that if we're being honest. But I will tell you this much. We at Brady, and I know a number of other organizations that are both on this call and or folks who volunteer and work with those groups, are thinking long and hard about what we need to do to go into states to make sure that they still have the ability to have the strongest concealed carry laws and the strongest gun laws in their country. And I think a lot of this immediate fallout is going to have to happen in the states.
A question somewhat tied to policy and what we can do as individuals. There's been a lot of talk about, businesses divesting from gun manufacturers in like 401k plans, or people pulling away their money from large businesses that do investment in and make profits from the gun industry. Does Brady get involved with that? And what is your thought with respect to that?
Yeah, I think that this is a really, really interesting area. And I think the way that we have seen it in our line of work, we do a lot of work with, not only, I think that there is really interesting paths forward with divestment. I think that there's also really interesting things that can be done with purchasing power, right? And procurement as well. One refrain that we talk about a lot at the Brady offices is that there's no bigger purchaser of firearms in this country than U.S. taxpayers, right? Because we buy lots of guns as U.S. taxpayers, both through military, through law enforcement, through federal agents, through state agents. There's a lot of firearms that are being purchased, and additionally, our governments do, through municipal markets and otherwise, and other business dealings. They do a lot of business with banks themselves that are doing business with gun dealers, so on and so forth. So there is a whole area, both in the corporate and private sector, as well as the government sector, where we should be able to influence best practices in order to promote life-saving, strategies that gun dealers should take on. Some of this has to do with what we are doing to promote everyday cultural practices like safe storage. But it also, in my mind, is a way that we can really push back on this idea of the flow of illegal guns that we have to live with right now, because we don't do enough to ensure that gun dealers are doing the safe and responsible practices necessary to prevent that illegal flow. So recently in Pennsylvania, for instance, we just released a report, and it was an analysis on crime gun trace data that showed what we have known to be true for many years, but we haven't had access because the gun industry has hidden the research necessary and the data necessary to understand the problem. But what it tells us is that guns that are traced back from crime in large part come from a very small number of gun dealers. Historically, we have said 5% of gun dealers are responsible for 90% of crime guns. And that's because the vast majority of gun dealers, that other 95% of gun dealers, are going above and beyond the federal minimum in order to prevent theft and straw purchasing. Straw purchasing is when somebody purchases a number of guns because they can't pass a background check, and then put those guns, divert them to the criminal market. So if we focus our energy on that 5%, we can have a massive impact on that flow of illegal guns, especially in communities of color that are disproportionately impacted by guns because of that flow of illegal guns. So Governor Murphy in New Jersey, just a number of years ago, issued an executive action that asked banks what questions they're asking gun dealers, and ask gun dealers, what practices are you doing to prevent theft and straw purchasing? Not necessarily to say we're not going to do business with this person or this person, but let's inform the decision-making process. And as a result, I think that we've been able to force a lot of industry change. So there is a lot of work that can be done in both of these spaces, but that's a little scratch at the surface of the way that we think about it in the supply side approaches to ending gun violence.
So someone put a question in the chat, and it's a question I have too. It says, we hear that the NRA has been diminished from what it once was. How does that impact the legislation we see, in the Senate and House, and how does it impact not only the Brady agenda, but the entire anti-gun violence movement?
It's a very good question, and I think it's right. I think the NRA, for all the years, especially since the leadership has really become so extreme in their agenda, the NRA is still, in large part, because of for a number of reasons, had a pretty high favorability rating. I think what we have seen in the last 10 years is not only do people better understand, the public better understand, that the NRA has been not only complicit, but has been willful and intentional in making our gun laws as weak as they are. But that the NRA has doubled down on a lot of these efforts and has really taken and done a lot of horrible dealings, from a Russian agent that was charged with espionage for trying to infiltrate the NRA to get closer to the GOP, all the way to the lawsuit that's happening in New York City with Letitia James, who has tried to take on the NRA to question how their practices align with their tax status. All of these things and overall public perception have certainly weakened the NRA and what they can do. Now, I will say, they still exist, and they're going to continue to still exist. And I think it's the same sort of the same demons and flames that they are stoking among the most hateful among us are the same ones that are making it hard for politicians in certain spaces to push back on armed extremism that we saw even when they themselves got attacked on January 6th, right? And there are political realities, not to mention the fact that every day that the NRA is weakened, or their public perception is weakened, there are groups like the NSSF, the National Sports Shooting Foundation, that says that they are purely there to represent the gun industry, where they are becoming more powerful and their spending is becoming exponential year after year. I frankly think that even while the NRA was at the peak of their power, in large part, they have been a paper tiger. Candidates that have forcefully run and taken on the NRA, guys like Tim Kaine, who's been doing it in Virginia, where the NRA has been headquartered for all these years, has always ran against the NRA. The NRA has built this facade by putting lots of money in small races, by having a very loud vocal minority, and they have been able to stoke fear and ultimately build political power through this, what I call like the paper tiger. Now, what has changed functionally over the last decade, especially since the horrific shooting at Sandy Hook, is groups like the ones here, right? Like everybody, each and every one of you who are here on this call are part of the reason why state after state across the country no longer are allowing weak gun laws to pass and are passing strong gun laws. Why the political power in Washington has shifted. In 2011, I saw half of the Democrats vote for concealed carry reciprocity, and that's simply not the case today. Now we have the incredible package that's been passed by the House of Representatives, and we have got signs that we have the strongest president that ever ran on this issue in the Oval Office, right? And we have got a Senate that is full of gun violence prevention safety champions as well, which is why we're seeing the progress that we're seeing now. Now, the Senate has procedural filibuster and other tactics similar to the gerrymandering we were talking earlier that make it hard because of the game is rigged, and we need to unrig that system, just like we do for so many issues. So this is my long-winded way of saying that the NRA may be down, but they're always going to exist. The only way we win isn't by worrying about the NRA. It's not by worrying about the NSSF. It's to continue to build power and to do so together, as evident by each and every one of you that are here today. If we keep showing up, we will win. And that is why I am excited for the future. But we can't give up. We have to keep on showing up.
And I want to end on a positive note. And, one of the things I hear often from people is this is such a big, overwhelming issue. What is something I can do to make a difference? So what would you say to people who are not elected officials, who are just coming to a Zoom like this, who are interested in making the world a better place for our children and grandchildren and neighbors? What are your top 3 things that we can do to make a difference?
Well, number one, above and beyond, way more than anything else, is just keep showing up. Like you are here tonight. That's not a small thing. It starts with this, right? This very thing that you're doing here. It starts with showing up. And look, Jill mentioned there are incredible local groups that exist in most states, right? Groups like Pennsylvania Ceasefire PA, which is an absolutely incredible organization that has been doing historic work in Pennsylvania for so long, and is going to functionally at some point break through some gridlock to make something happen in Pennsylvania. There are state groups across the country that are working like Ceasefire PA, that are, and please look for them and show up for their events too. Make sure that, and if there's not the states groups, I promise you that Brady has a presence, or someone has a presence. The other organizations, maybe it's Giffords, maybe it's Moms Demand Action. We all work together. We have got to keep showing up to end gun violence in this country. So do that, but also make sure you remember your legislators work for you. At the end of the day, all of the legislators that represent you, they may be intimidating, they may be frustrating, they work for you. Every phone call you make is recorded. They tally that. Every letter I will tell you this much: a handwritten letter is one of the most powerful things you can ever do to influence a legislator, because it takes time and people just don't mail things anymore. So do that, write letters, make calls, keep showing up, and help support incredible organizations like the ones that are here today.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being on this call. There will be a recording of this Zoom. You can go to the DJOP YouTube channel and I will send it out. I will also send out the donation links. Please support the Brady campaign. They're doing fabulous work. Please support Ceasefire PA. To my PA folks, we are doing absolutely wonderful work, if I do say so myself. And please support Representative Castro, who's been outspoken advocate on this issue. And in this really tough election cycle, we need to support Democrats like him. And we need to support every Democrat in these battleground states, because they are literally a battleground. It's going to be a fight for every last vote. Thank you to everyone on the Battleground Coalition, and especially Linda Frank and Rosalie Weisfeld, who helped get these speakers. And again, thank you so much, and donate and write and speak out, and together we can make the world a better place. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Linda. Thank you,
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody.
Christian.
Thank you.